Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 158th New Social Environment. My name is Catherine, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation on the life and work of Philip Guston with Robert Storr and Phong H. We're also thrilled to have the poet Ramya Ramana here, who will read to close today's program. This October also marks the Rail's 20th anniversary, and we're committed to remaining independent, free, and accessible to everyone. Before we begin, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that we are on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. We acknowledge the many indigenous nations with ties to this land, and we recognize that the Lenape still call Mannahatta home. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprising unfolding across the country, following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashard Brooks, Raya Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, and Toyin Salau, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. Before I introduce our host, please join us for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Our guest today, Robert Storr, is a preeminent art critic, curator, artist, and educator, and is the former dean of Yale School of Art and senior curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA. He's written numerous catalogs, articles, and books on major 20th and 21st century artists, and he's been researching and writing on the work of Philip Guston for more than 3 decades. Our host, Phong H. is an artist, writer, independent curator, publisher, and artistic director of the Brooklyn Rail, the River Rail, Rail Editions, and Rail Curatorial Projects. Without further ado, Phong, hand it off to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Robert, for being here with us to talk about the profound and lasting contribution that you refer Philip Guston in your last chapter, which I love, the remarkable come from behind kid, the absolute relevance of his work, both as a person and an artist in him, and how the two were neither ever products of declarative pronouncement of self-assurance. Even at the moment of most intense doubt about life in relation to art. What is so compelling, I think, for all of us who've seen the work, experienced it, is how willingly his honesty and vulnerability get revealed, get materialized as matter. And he was so impatiently with all of that purity by the end of the 60s, when liberal optimism of the Kennedy era ended with numerous assassinations, of course, with Kennedy and then Dr. King and then Robert Kennedy Jr., which led to endless demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. And then, of course, the demonstration for the civil rights movement and the women liberation movement, while there were other endless cases of police violence, among other countless, I would say, social unrest and so on. So when he stated clearly, when the 1960 came along, I was feeling split, schizophrenic, the war, what was happening in America, the brutality of the world. What kind of man am I? Sitting at home, reading magazines, going into a frustrated fury about everything, and then going to my studio to adjust a red and a blue. It's impossible to predict when or how powerful the power of art until we most need it. Recently, I was reminded a story about Boris Pasternak during the 3-day long Soviet Congress, Writer Congress during the Moscow trial, probably 1937, which we might be able to go into briefly in the early phase of Guston when he was in LA, when each day everyone was forced to express their endless thanks to Stalin, the brother father Stalin, for the new model of truth. As I remember, Pasternak was in total silence. The entire time he was standing alone below the stage, not far from Andrei Zadanov, the Stalinist killer. On the very last day, when Pasternak's friends asked him, requested that since he would be arrested anyway, perhaps he would say something so they can live by. So he did. He walked up on the stage, he gave a number, Sonnet 30. 2,000 writers, poets, intellectuals who were there stood up and they all recited the entire sonnet by heart from Pasternak Russian translation. Some of us remember the first famous two lines at least, went to the section of sweet silence thought. I summon up remembrance of things past. This says everything, doesn't it? Joseph Stalin, who have killed nearly 1 million Russians, can't destroy Shakespeare. He can't destroy Russian language. He can't destroy the fact that they know the sonnet by heart, what Pasternak have given them. So I'm super happy being here with Robert. I just want to show you this book. This is the reason why we're here. I was sharing this not long ago to Musa and Sally, Musa Mayer, Philip Guston's daughter, Sally Radek, the director of the Guston Foundation. And I say, it's as big as my torso. And she said, yeah, your torso is small, that's why, which is true. But at any rate, it's big, Robert. So welcome, welcome. I can't wait to talk about the book. I remember reading your first book, Robert. It's just simply called Guston, published by Waterville Press in '86 when I was a student at the New York Studio School, where at the time, I remember you and Jackie Bruckner, the ecological artist, was the co-interim deans. The first book was indeed an impressive pleasure for one-day reading, which I did in one day. But I remember the total word count was no more than 7 or 8, you know, as compared to this monumental volume, which the title is terrific, Philip Guston, A Lifespan Painting, with a wonderful chronology by Amanda Renshaw. At any rate, it took me 3 days to read it. Just finished, it's just like half an hour before this, actually. So I assume it counted somewhere, maybe 30,000 words, it's hard to tell. But as you indicated in your move-in introduction, PG internal return, Robert, in between having written several essays and catalog text on his work, this volume reminds you that you are now a year older when Guston died in 1980 at the age of 66. And as you say, no writer will ever have the last word of any artist of consequence, which I'm total in agreement. Still, what and which aspect of Guston's work, if not all of it, or how Guston's work in its totality have kept you so invested, so fascinated for so long? I mean, if you can share us now, whatever you can sort of short or mid-size meditation before we begin with the selective image, and then we can tell a fuller story. How did it all began for you and how long it took?
The simplest answer to that question is that Guston's ambivalences are not exactly mine, but they overlap mine in some crucial places. And Guston was an artist of ambivalences. He had many different things that seized him and compelled him and wouldn't let go. He had constantly to, I'm sorry, what? Okay, I heard some background. Anyway, he had constantly to reconnect with things and reconsider things and establish space in which he could work out ideas that just wouldn't let go of him. So I'm like that. And in fact, I've written 2 books on many people, and that's because I don't have the last word even for myself. So, you know, Guston is the one with whom I have perhaps the longest relationship, but I find it that with really major artists, you think your way through what you think of them and what you know of them, and then there's always something more to learn. And then there are always more of what somebody once called l'esprit de l'escalier, or the devil on the stairs, the second thoughts, the third thoughts, the things I should have said. So this book is the sort of the catch basin for all those things I should have said since 1986.
was it intended to coincide with the forthcoming show in the Ford Gallery, which we won't get into the controversy of it, but it was intended to be part of that.
I don't think that was the original plan, but pretty soon we realized that they were likely to converge, and indeed they have converged. But this was an independent project. The show that the curators at the National Gallery and at the Tate Modern and in Boston and in Houston did was its own thing. So, but I don't think you can celebrate Guston too much. And of course, the book is not a show. These are big paintings, and as big a book as this is, it's not nearly big enough to encompass the scale of these paintings. So, I just think it's a good thing that they're, but I also think the times have turned in the direction of Guston again for a whole host of reasons. And we can go into those if you like, but the point is that for whatever reasons, here's this guy who hasn't been with us for 20 whatever odd years, and who is truly of the moment now still, which is one of the definitions of really important art that doesn't become dated, doesn't become period. And I think that's, attests to how major he is.
Yes, absolutely. Why don't we begin with the images, Nikki? Can we have the first photograph? This is essentially appear in the first chapter, a wandering Jew set out. He was born in Montreal, 1913, as we know, as Philip Guston to Louis and Rachel Guston. Both of his parents were immigrants from Odessa. Guston was the youngest of 7 children. And this is, I don't know, he's 10 years old? Robert?
Yes, something like that. I mean, I don't remember exactly, but yes, he's something like that. And he looks like he's ready to take on the world.
Yep. So this is maybe 3 years before his father's suicide. It's amazing to see the calm and confident look, as you say, in his face, and the crossed arms say a lot about him. You absolutely. He looked older than he appears. No, or
he has a sort of a presence that is beyond his years. Yes, he does absolutely. And I think that when people have that, it gives an impression to people that makes people encourage them to grow and prosper. Guston dropped out of high school.
mm-hmm.
He went to college. He never went to university. He went straight into a life of making paintings from having been a high school dropout. He didn't go straight without any further tutelage. He had tutors on the side, St. John Fransky and others. But he really did strike out on his own, and he was a very brave kid. And as some people may or may not know, one of his classmates in high school was Jackson Pollock. Yep. And he and Pollock were expelled initially for having written some satires of their high school publications. And Pollock, the rebel, went back to school with his tail between his legs. Guston just carried on. So in later years, when they were all often compared to each other, and Guston was thought to be the less rebellious of the two, stylistically or whatever, the fact of the matter is he's the more rebellious in terms of personality.
Yeah, it's so true. Nikki, can we see the next image, which is, I think the mirror was destroyed since, but this is the panel depicting the persecution of the Scarborough Boys, painted in 1930, Robert. Can you share a little bit?
Yes, well, I mean, this was a period in American history, which actually was a very long period of history, when persecution of blacks was rampant, when actual lynching was rampant. And by that I mean, the old school lynching. And there's a drawing that was in the exhibition at the Modern, which was one of the things that brought down the wrath of I don't know who, which was done, I think, in 1939. But this is much earlier. And this was actually destroyed, if I'm not mistaken, by sort of goon squads. And this is Guston started out as a left-wing painter, and as beyond that, is simply as a convinced humanist, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one also has to remember that at this time, being Jewish in America was to put you in jeopardy, right? Jews were persecuted regularly and publicly. There was a famous lynching case in the South of I think his name was Leo Frank, who was lynched by the KKK about 10 years or so before Guston was born. and or maybe 5 years before Guston. But anyway, so the identification Guston had with this kind of racism was in part in solidarity with African Americans, and in part it was an expression of his own sense of the jeopardy of being a Jew in America.
Next image, Nick. So this is what really compelling, the fact that he was so young when he made this mural. He's maybe 21 years old. So this is called Struggle Against War and Fascism in the former Palazzo of Maximilian in Mexico, painted between 34 to 35, with his friend Ruben Kadish and Jules Lansner. So this is amazing for a young painter who had yet been to Italy to see, Signorelli or Michelangelo, Robert.
That's true, although I think you have to remember that in Mexico, there were a host of mural painters, and the big three were Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and Siqueiros, who was his sponsor for this project. And they had been painting big heroic scale paintings, and they had seen the murals in Italy, so there was a direct traditional painterly conduit, if you will, between Italy and Mexico at this time. And he had studied the Renaissance with several of his tutors in California. And then again, he had the patronage of Siqueiros in particular for this mural. So Italy was far away in distance, and he had yet to see them firsthand, but he had certainly steeped himself in this tradition.
Yeah, it's so true. Forgive me, my neighbor upstairs is playing music very loud. So I'm bringing my laptop to the next room, so it'll be more quiet. Bear with me.
What's he playing?
Oh God, he's very unpredictable. I think here may be good. How's that? Can you guys hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Right. So yes, Signorelli, who have a significant influence on Michelangelo, particularly The Last Judgment. So here we see that very clearly. Can we go to the next one and then come back later, maybe? Yeah.
Okay. This is the cartoon, so-called, for the facade of the WAPA Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair, which was a very important commission and one of his last big commissions as a mural painter in this country. Because in addition to the things he did in Mexico, the thing he did in Mexico, he did many murals, and Musi, his wife, also painted murals. So they had a career running from the mid-30s to the very early 40s and on, making mural paintings in this country. And this is the cartoon for that last big project.
Yep, and we see the very robust style, very solid rendering of the figure. So this was painted in 1939. So that was still the height of the WPA. What we see looking at also, Robert, was Leger and Picasso neoclassicism was in his mind, you think?
Could have been, because Leger actually was commissioned to do a mural at the same World's Fair, and he hired Bill de Kooning to be one of his mural assistants. And there was a lot of this going. James Brooks was involved too. And if you go to the marine terminal at LaGuardia Airport, you can still see this fantastic mural by Jim Brooks that has a lot of the same kind of sort of volumetric figuration in it. It doesn't have a heroic subject matter of the dramatic nature of this exactly, but it does have an heroic subject matter, which is flight. And it's a painting really worth seeing.
Yeah, and it certainly lead to the next painting, which I was lucky to have seen it, Bombardment, Nikki. Can we see that incredible painting? Painted 1937, depicting, unlike the opposite of what we saw, common stability. I mean, here what we see is the opposite.
Well, this is Guston's, if you want to say, response to Guernica, to both Picasso's painting and to the event itself. And he does an interesting thing. It's not a very large painting, but it's a tondo rather than a rectangular. So if Guernica is a great mural composition in a square format, this compresses all of this, but it compresses it around the explosion of the bombs coming down. And that means that everything in the painting is flung out to the edges from this violent center explosion. And it's a very smart way to handle a very difficult artistic problem. And in this painting, I think to the greatest extent in any of this work, his tendency to use mannerist kinds of foreshortening and tipping of planes and so on works to the poetic or also political effect of the image. It's an astonishing painting.
Yeah, and then the lead right next to the next one, Martial Memory, painted in 1941, I think, when indicating return to the studio, so to speak. And I think this is when he took the job teaching at University of Iowa.
Correct, that's correct, yeah. And all the while that he'd been in California, he'd been very much impressed by the cuticle.
Yeah.
And by a certain kind of nostalgia, about a certain kind of delicacy of light and dark, and so on. So after having painted these big heroic paintings for public purposes on public themes, he withdrew into a kind of introspection. And think of how much of a fish out of water he would have been. He was a New York artist predominantly, although he had been a California artist. He was a Jew in the middle of the Midwest where there weren't very many. And he was, in a sense, creating his own imaginary landscape and his own poetic version of a childhood he actually never had.
And notice the boy right in the front with his back against the viewer holding the trash can lid, another incredible motif that will reappear later.
Correct.
Not to mention the brick wall behind, Robert.
Yes, that's true.
Yep.
And there's just humor in this. I mean, the kid, instead of a heraldic kind of jouster's helmet, he's got a teapot on his head. I mean, there's wit in these paintings more so than maybe we, and you'll see a teapot coming up later on in his late paintings. So nothing goes to waste in Guston. It all comes back in different forms and in different registers.
Yes, let us see next one, Nikki, is called If This Be Not I. So that's painted 4 years later in 45, I think.
Yes,
So,
it's larger.
yeah.
It's even more De-Chirico-esque or magic realist or whatever you want to call it. It's more poetically, overtly poetic, and sort of it evokes both the never land of the Midwest, of small town Middle America, and it is very Italianate. And he called himself Italianate at one point in notes that he made. And he dreamed of Italy. He longed for Italy long before he went there. And he had studied Italy. It was sort of, unlike many of the New York painters, he was not interested in Paris particularly, but he was interested in Italy.
And in some odd way too, because there's a certain aura of American heartland with a certain filmic space.
Yeah.
I feel, but then also there's the beloved frozen space of Paolo Uccello, Battle San Romano.
Yes, indeed. And that was a painting that meant a lot to him.
Yeah. Well, I love that painting too. The old three panel. Gotta go to see it. Paris, National Gallery in London, and the one in Fiji. So Nikki, can we go to Gladiators? This painted 4 years earlier, but I thought it was painted to show everyone just because the motif that we mentioned earlier, the extended hand holding the trash can earlier. Yep.
It's the trash can, it's the helmets, it's the paper hat. All of this stuff comes back in other forms later on, and it's kids' violence being a kind of a metaphor for real violence in the world, right? And of course, if you know what New York was like then or now, kids fighting in the street were not always so gentle. So this is maybe a little less gentle than he makes it look.
Is it possible, Robert, that he might have seen the Chirico painting in the late 20s of the cramped, really homoerotic, claustrophobic gladiators?
I don't think he saw those, but he did see quite a lot of De-Chirico at the Ahrensberg's collection in Los Angeles. And
Right.
then when he went to New York, he would have seen a lot. The gladiators, I don't know exactly what their exhibition history was in this country. He might have seen them, but he wouldn't have seen a lot.
But you think that he would recognize the kind of parody of traditional values through kitsch, through the kind of garish color that appear in the Chirico late works?
No, I don't think so, because I don't think at this point in his life Guston was at all interested in kitsch or satire or whatever. I think he was utterly earnest, in fact. So I think he was trying to find his own vocabulary. And I think there's a kind of sentimental undercurrent to some of these paintings that makes people uncomfortable. It doesn't bother me. But, I don't think there was anything about them that was ironic in that sense.
Yeah, I didn't either. So let's just show one example next close inflation drill, just to share with everyone that he indeed made some illustration when he was commissioned. This one is by Fortune magazine and Army Air Corps. I think the Kunin did a few too during that period. But let's show this one.
And this is a drill for people to survive if they're torpedoed at sea. And the idea was that you blow up your pants legs and you use them as kind of water wings. But the point is, there are later paintings which you will see called Deluge and other things, which are of the flood, basically the biblical proverbial flood. And this is an early rehearsal for that subject matter. And this sort of bobbing of closely packed figures is something that comes back again. Nothing is wasted in Guston.
Yep, it's so true. Next one, we're gonna go through fairly quickly, because I know that everyone have questions to ask Robert. So that's why we're going through this fairly quick pace. But nevertheless, it's a good pace. This painting was one of my favorite when I saw it, painted in 47 to 48, and during his first Prix de Rome. And in a way, wouldn't one say that its first attempt working for abstraction?
Well, Sally Raddick can tell us exactly, because there's some dispute about whether this ever went to Rome. And I can't be the one to pronounce on it because I don't actually know. But in any case, he painted 3 paintings at this time, red painting, this one, and one other, where he sort of made his first forays into overall abstraction. But in this, you can see there's these tracery white drawings. And one of the things you see is this sort of horseshoe shape with little pinpoints in it. And it's basically the heel of somebody's shoe.
Yeah.
And other things in here that are references to drawings that he had boiled down and distilled and boiled down and distilled until it was only a structure of lines and shapes and intervals that he had left. But this is the beginning of Guston's full-blown abstraction.
Mm-hmm. And I love the ghostly skeleton white drawing weaving between the red patches, red form, bring it all the frontal plane, but it don't you think that it evoke a certain kind of already still-like motif of the table in some way?
It could. I mean, he was aware of again, metaphysical still life as practiced by de Chirico and others was very much on his mind, right? But for example, that kind of orange or golden thing in the disc in the lower corner there, that is probably the bell of a trumpet. And there are paintings that preceded it where it would be no question but that's what it was. So he developed a form vocabulary where the significance or references for those forms were now sort of untethered and free floating. And that's where the real action happened in his work.
Yeah, and if you ever seen this painting in flash, it's so beautifully painted.
Yes, it is.
It's unbelievable. It's like Chardin. Okay, Nikki, I think we're gonna move to the next chapter. All or nothing at all. 1950 onward. This is the one that we deliberately chose because most of us have seen it. It belonged to the Modern Museum collection.
Yes.
And painted in 1954. This is very interesting to me because I was thinking, years ago when I was a student at the studio school, I was working for Louis Finkelstein. You know, Robert?
Sure, I remember very well.
Campbell, who taught there too. And he was talking to me about this group of Guston in the very particular article that he wrote, which he gave to me. It's called New Look Abstract Expressionism in 1956, I think. So it's very interesting, that term. It's abstract impressionism, and I just don't understand it.
I don't understand it either, and I think it was just a convenient style label to distinguish it from the more energetic abstract expressionism. But I don't think either term is a very useful term, frankly. I mean, I think this comes out of many things, but the thing it most definitely comes out of is Mondrian's plus minus paintings.
Yes.
of a series of marks that suggest a grid but don't lock in as a grid. And the fact that he was, on the one hand, interested in Quirico and on the other hand, interested in Mondrian is an indication of how open the possibilities were at that time for American painters who were just beginning to find their way through the maze of styles and personalities and structures of modernist painting. And this is relatively early on in the phase of all over abstract painting. There's a painting called Painting where he describes the experience of having gone up to the surface of the canvas with nothing planned and just mark making until he had come to the end of his sort of creative burst and then stepping back to see what he had. And that's this kind of a painting, except this one represents days and days of doing that because you can see the number of layers and the ways in which a gray cancels a rose or something like that. He didn't know where the painting was until he found it. And he found it by making a mark and then moving around. Now, later on in the 60s, when he said he didn't want to any longer be confined to adjusting a red to a blue, it shows you what he could do when he did do exactly that.
Yeah. So when you reference about the plus and minus formation to Mondrian, I'm thinking, of course, the classic piers and ocean.
Yes.
Particularly just because the oval shape, so you can see that hovering in the middle there evoke that similar configuration. But I still don't understand, Robert, because New Look Abstract Impressionism was published in the same time as Clement Greenberg, the late Monet essay. So is that the reason that Louis might have thought similarly?
I can't recapitulate what was going on at that time, and frankly, I don't care. I think these paintings exist out of time, and if you place them in time a little bit in the way that you're doing, fine. But finally, they are free of that time. They are free of their immediate circumstances, and they are paintings, and they're all in the present tense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fair. Let's move on, Nick and Nick. The Dial, another great painting, one of my favorite. I think this one is at the Whitney. And we see here living forms seem to coalesce in the center, flashlight form even. So what can you share with us, Robert, in terms of concept of time? You mentioned about that in your, text.
I think what goes on from this point to the end of his abstract period is a tug of war between centripetal and centrifugal forces. And in this, he is, again, in some ways rooted in Mondrian, but I would say he's equally rooted in Giacometti and in what it means to build a surface to center and locate and then dislocate that same form. He didn't, in fact, describe or draw or circumscribe forms, but he dealt in dabs or blots or chunks of color, and what he called colored dirt, which is paint. But you can see in the top right-hand corner of this painting, there is raw canvas there. So the gray that is the top of this color, which gives that kind of Tiepolo blue, its glow, is actually unpainted. So in the graphic sense, it is centered and builds towards the center, but also in a physical sense. There is relief of paint in the center, and there's almost nothing at the corner, and then finally there's nothing.
So leading to this painting, that's the one we saw before, and I know that group was very much admired by John Cage. That very period is very interesting because Guston was longing for some serenity, condition of serenity, calmness, and whatnot. So how do you feel how he relate to Cage, where Cage was more, responsive to his reductive painting, like the one we saw before, or Old Tar and Zone, which we don't have here? Were they good friends?
They were friends for a period of time, and it was through Cage that he met Morty Feldman. Morty Feldman's friendship carried on for a long time. Cage lost interest in Guston at a certain point, and there's some fairly caustic things in his letters about Guston, but then Cage could be kind of a bitch. So
yes,
that's okay. People are.
Then how broke he was.
Yeah, I mean, his beatific persona is true enough, but it's also only part of him. So anyway, but Cage was hugely important to Guston, as he was to Jasper Johns, as he was to elsewhere, and so on. Artists who met him at that time met an extraordinary man, and that man was able to articulate a plausible position where you didn't have to take sides, where not everything was either or, where not everything was this or that, and that was a liberating thing, since Guston was a product of 1930s political realities, which were fascism or communism, since he was a product of 1930s aesthetics, which was figuration or abstraction, and he didn't feel entirely comfortable in either camp. So Cage was a balm and a permission and a way of working his way out of the deadlock of hard choices, which is not to say into some sort of bland no place, but rather into a case of making it up as you go along and knowing where you are by the evidence of what you've done.
Yeah, and Nikki, the clock is next. This painting was painted a year after, and I was very compelled by the somber tone in this painting, Robert. And you notice the predominant use of black become more prominent. So tell us a little bit more about that shift here.
Well, I think this is a painting that was given to MoMA by what's his name? Anyway, it'll come to me. The famous waspish architect.
Philip Johnson.
Philip Johnson, yes, okay. And Philip Johnson was a great aid to the MoMA for years and years and years, because he would buy the things that they wanted but didn't have money for. And he bought this, he bought countless other things. He bought the Schlemmer staircase, he bought Jasper John's flag, and he had a sufficient amount of money, and he had a willingness to play the game, and he trusted Barr absolutely. So this was at a time when Guston was still entering into his maturity as a painter. He was still not really a member in full standing of the New York club, but he was indeed a well-recognized painter. I mean, the sort of the resistance to Guston in New York was pretty strong, and people tended to treat him as an outsider even within the inner circles. And so I think that pained him a great deal. I think he took his distance from New York to be away from that kind of pressure. So the acquisition of this painting was a big deal. And it was, around this time that his reputation really took off as an abstract painter. Yeah. Prior to that, he had been sort of thought of as a Johnny-come-lately, although I'm not sure what that word means, because also Franz Klein started almost the same year he did it to make fully abstract painting. But there was this sort of cliquishness about abstraction in New York, and he suffered at the hands of it.
Yeah, and they always showing Charles Egan at the same time, so I don't understand why he would be regarded as not in the center. But can we show the next one so that we see the successiveness of the dial painted in 56, what we saw there is now the clock, 57. This is to Fellini, amazing painting too, in 58. Yeah. So you see, oh wow, well, I remember seeing this painting.
Okay, well this is where he goes full color, where he opens up the scale of the mark, where he opens up the expansiveness of central imagery. He begins to spread out.
Yes.
He's also joyous in the way that the others were not. The title is also a kind of hint. Guston grew up in Los Angeles. He had been an extra in films. He had looked at films very carefully all his life, and he, was interested in what films had to offer as an art form. So he began to think in filmic terms or cinematic terms, even though he wasn't doing anything stylistically that way. The idea of, Fellini was very much interested in carnivals and circuses and all of that. So this was a meeting of spirits, not of styles, but it was an identification with that strain of Italian art, which was Commedia dell'arte, which was, neo-realist film, like the film about the strongman, La Strada. And all of this is going on in this painting in the background, not in the foreground. In the foreground, it is just Guston doing what Guston did, which was to find his place and figure out how he could hold it as a painter, and how paint could hold its place.
And I couldn't believe how Anthony Quinn would dub in Italian in the movie. It's so odd.
But by this time, by the way, he had been to Italy. Before, we were looking at paintings by somebody who had not been to Italy. But as of the period of the time that he painted the Tormentors, he was on the Prix de Rome. And so he went to Italy. He went around and saw all those old master paintings, and in particular, the big murals, the frescoes that he had not seen before. So he came back, not just a cosmopolitan in spirit, but a cosmopolitan in fact.
And the congestion of space also recall also the painting earlier that reference to film too, Robert. If this be not I.
Yeah.
A similar reference there. Did he ever meet Fellini when he was in Italy?
I know that he met De Chirico, but I don't know who he met otherwise.
Oh.
He could very well have. I mean, in those days, the art world and the cultural world in Italy was very small.
Yeah. So the big shift is about to happen. The next image, which is quite amazing. We chose only 2 images just to show you that very profound period that he was going through. You know, this was included in the Jewish Museum with the beautiful essay of Dory Aston. This is 1966. So this is only after the first retrospective of the Guggenheim. So that's just 4 years really before. That's 62, I believe. So painting with one or sometime 2 things float in the middle, the form, black form, and painted pretty much on unstretched canvas, stable against the wall, and painted in one sitting. As I remember, we talked once about this.
I don't know that this was painted in one sitting. It may have been, but there are many of these paintings that he worked on for days.
Yeah.
It's also important to note that even though it was painted on unstretched canvas, he was mindful of where the edge was. So that here again, you have a lot of exposed canvas around the edges. Mm-hmm. So it's as if the black hole is like a black hole in space, sucking energy into it and pulling it away from the edges. And that's something that was very unusual at that time.
And what was the decision to reduce the palette only black and white and tiny bit of red occasionally, Robert?
I can't really say. I think it allowed him to make tone changes, subtle tone changes, and to follow his own brushwork, his own gesture in ways that would have been harder had he had to plan out the way in which lots of colors together. He didn't actually plan that much in Fellini. There's a lot of color in it. But he rarely mixed halftones. He usually mixed them on the surface with his brush. So it's not as if he was an impressionist painter. We're mixing down on a palette and holding it up to the painting and seeing if it fit. He would do the mixing in the act of painting. And this allowed him to do more painting in proportion to the color shifts.
Okay. Nikki, can we see the next one? Because it's just painted in the same year, more or less, or year after. So this one is very compelling just because the black form is shifted off center, Robert, and then you see the tiny line on the left there hovering, as if an indication or suggesting a gesture of the whip that we see later.
Well, there is definitely something like that going on. And he also makes this much more opaque than the previous one, much heavier. And it is a silhouette, and you can imagine that there is, in fact, a figure or an object there. So this is not in terms of time, but in terms of thought process, because his evolution away from these paintings and into full abstraction took several years. But you can see him allowing these forms to bulk up and become presences.
Yeah. You want a glass of water? Your voice is sort of dry.
It's just my voice has gotten this way from too much teaching.
Oh, all right. Nikki, can we go to the next one, which is chapter 3, Word Enough and Time. So this is 1966 onward, Robert. I wonder whether this comes from Andrew Marvell's famous poem, To His Coy Mistress. Am I right?
It does, and it's my favorite poem.
So is mine.
Has been since I read it in high school.
Me too. Had we but were enough and time, this coyness lady were no crime. Woo! Yes, love that one. Okay, so let's. Why did you choose that line?
As of this time, he knew that time was finite. He didn't live a healthy life, and he also knew that he had a lot of work in him. So he stepped up the pace of what he did. His doubts were not resolved as doubts, but he was like going for broke from this time onwards. and he just painted image after image after image. He had developed a language, he's developed a way of composing and inventing on the surface of each painting, and he developed a way of using very little color, but using it to highlight, to shape, to occupy space. And so you can see in this painting, for example, there's an overall cobalt blue on the ground. There's something that he's brushed out that's over on the right-hand side, but it's there as a phantom almost. And then the rest of it is this very rich, dark, orangey red, or just reddy red. And he's making it up as he goes along right in front of you with minimal means and with great effect. Also, this is a huge painting, and this is dedicated to MF, and that MF is Morty Feldman.
Yep.
And Morty Feldman came to his, I think his studio or to his storage facility to look at paintings that he was making prior to his Marlborough show of 1970. And Morty Feldman was at a loss for words. And Guston took this very hard. They'd been close companions all the way through the body of work we'd just seen. And Morty had been the person who'd helped him articulate his thoughts about what that kind of in-between space was. As I said, much more Morty than John. But by the time he got to these paintings, Morty just didn't know what to say any longer and backed away from him. And then that broke that friendship. But he kept thinking of Morty all along in the years thereafter, and he painted this one overt commemoration of their friendship. And then he shows up again in another painting, which has several people in it. But the point is that Morty was a tough immigrant Jewish guy like him. Both had big appetites. They both liked drinking. They both liked women. They both liked food. And they also had a similarly complex and subtle culture, because these great big guys were also at the same time people who were connoisseurs of all kinds of subtle, nuanced things. So the combination of the rough and the refined existed in both of them, and they just hit it off. And so when that friendship broke, it was a huge loss for Guston.
Yeah, he was a big man, Robert. He once picked me up with his left hand at the studio school. Yep, he certainly did that. And here he looks away. So that's indicated that friendship. But it's remind me too that few lines in the beginning of that same poem. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. Remember?
Yep.
What a beautiful, beautiful poem. Nikki, can we see the next one?
And also, one should say that it was Feldman who was asked to say Kaddish for Guston at the burial.
Yeah. So this is a self-portrait crop from the bottom. What's going on here?
This is, I think, a fairly straightforward self-portrait, but it's the look of somebody who is kind of haunted, and it's done in all the same deftness of description that went into his caricatures, and that went into later paintings. You can see what he can do with almost no lines. And there's somebody that I introduced into the conversation, which is not necessarily pertinent to this painting, but it is pertinent to what goes on in this work generally, which is Sengai Gibbon, who was a Zen painter who showed what could be done with almost nothing. And Gibbon was capable of making abstractions, so to speak, and he did things with triangles, circles, and squares, but he also drew figures in the most amazingly deft caricature portraits. And so I think that that's another part of the legacy of Cage and Feldman was Zen painting.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's curious to me too, because it was painted in 1968. So between 65 leading to that year, he basically stopped painting rubber and moved down to Florida to with Conrad Maccarelli. Basically just devoted his entire time making drawings,
That's
so,
correct.
Okay, so it's a treat. The next page here, we're gonna see whether any of you guys can identify which are those characters from the New York school here. We won't tell you, but look carefully with pleasure, and later we can show you again when we open up for Q&A. That will be a terrific game that we can play.
And let me editorialize also that when Guston first showed these later paintings, he was hammered by, among others, Hilton Kramer, for having gone slumming, for having picked up vulgar, contemporary comic style for his work. And meanwhile, the people who did contemporary comics chastised him for having gone slumming, also for having come and stole their act. The fact of the matter is that Guston started drawing comics as a kid at home. He would copy the comic strip pages that came with every Sunday paper. And he also, throughout his life, did caricatures of friends. And these are a sampling, but only a sampling, of his caricatures. There's some wonderful ones that are not here. One of Betty Parsons, one of John Cage, and more. So when people look at his later work and say, well, why did he suddenly start cartooning? It wasn't subtle a bit. It was a constant of his work.
Yeah, it's so true, which segue to the next set of images perfectly. These are what we call the alphabet paintings, which was included in that beautiful show, beautifully curated at Yale University Gallery, and then it went to the Facade Museum by Harry Cooper and Johanna Weber. I think it's 2000, 2001 maybe. I drove up to see it, and it was a wonderful show. So tell us a little bit of the genesis of this dramatic switch to paint singular image, one object each time.
I think he was trying to establish his vocabulary, his vocabulary of symbols. And he was trying to establish the most efficient way to paint them so that they'd be recognizable, but also some of the permutations. So he painted the same things over and over and over again, each time differently, each time not one-to-one scale, but each time so that they occupy a space or area that is something like reality, what they would be in reality. So the room that he took his rests in from the studio is full of these paintings. It's almost as he went to bed, lay down, and looked at them, and they fed his imagination on his way to and as on his way from a dream or nap. And they're amazing. They're wonderful paintings.
Yes, come on. Next one, Nikki. How does that relate to when you say he painted them repeatedly? So if repetition is what he had in mind, how does that correspond to what's going on in minimalism at the time, or conceptual art?
I don't think there's that much of a correlation, although there's certain aspects of it that might be. I think there's an element of satire when he paints bricks when Carl Andre is out there doing bricks. But he's cognizant of Carl Andre, but he's also saying, let's have a little bit of fun with this. So I think there's an element of satire. But I just think he was getting, there's the expression, the mind in the hand, that was used by the French critic Henri Faucillon. And that says basically that the hand knows things that, it's almost like Pascal's reason has its reason, which reason cannot know. The hand knows things that the eye or mind don't know. And I think Guston rehearsed his shapes till the hand actually could make its own decisions. And then he would consider those decisions and decide to preserve some and then not others. But when we talk about automatism is not an absolute thing, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in a dream state to do it. It may be there in front of you. It may be the most physical, real thing in your world is to try and describe something.
Yeah, and this corresponded absolutely to the previous body of drawing that he made in Florida, which is also singular at time only, one or two lines. So it's a similar mindset.
Well, that was his struggle with minimalism. Those drawings really are his attempt to come to terms with the least that can be done to make something hold. And I think there are both cases where it looked like he was doing minimalism, much as Motherwell did minimalism with his open series. There are Guston drawings that have some of the same feel, and he was a friend of Motherwell's. Yeah. But also, I think it was the point at which he began to move into this other territory. So there are parallel drawings that are recognizable images that have almost the same qualities.
Yep, Nick, but I think the clause is, this is a beauty.
Yeah, this is a beauty.
That's a beauty.
And this is 2/3 of Sengai, because the thing that's missing from Sengai is the circle.
Yeah, that's right. And the next one
in Sengai, it is the universe. Those three forms together symbolize the universe. And when we get to the Roma drawings, you'll see that he basically conjugates a series of very simple forms to create an entire Italian garden.
Yeah, and this one is seemed to inscribe to Bill. Is that Bill Bergson or?
I have no idea. It could be.
Yeah. Can we see the next one, Nick?
And this I love because this is a hairy light bulb. This light bulb becomes the cheeks of Richard Nixon, which are based on Richard Nixon's scrotum.
Yeah.
And the thing that is the element for the light bulb above bends down and becomes Richard Nixon's nose. So the metamorphic qualities of these drawings are incredible, and the metamorphosis is a drawing activity.
Yeah, amazing. The next one is, I believe, is Paul. Yep, this one is amazing too. Notice the hand is coming from the side and it has a bit of hair. Keep that in mind because we're gonna show you how it come back later in a kind of a biblical force.
Yes.
Power. So keep that in mind. Now we're gonna move to the very first. I'm not so sure, but you can correct me. The next one, Nikki, is an untitled, but it's really, would this be considered the first appearance of the Klansmen in the 30s, Robert?
I don't think so, but I can't say for sure. Sally Raddick would know that. But I think it's, to all intents and purposes, it's the most resonant because the red eyes of the Klansman, the sort of desperate look of the Klansman means that beneath this hood is somebody to be feared, but also somebody who is full of fear. And I think that's another thing. Okay, to go back to the Sangai thing, the triangle becomes the hood. So a geometric shape becomes an organic human shape, but that human shape was also an emblem of terror.
Yeah.
But the emblem of terror is also terrorized.
Yes. And also the line, incomplete line, it's also referred to the drawing that he was making in Florida.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, the classic.
And that's a classic painting, yes. That is where the hooded man paints himself, the hooded artist. But this is also a shift where, whereas in the Klan paintings that are identifiably marauders, they're the villains. Now the artist as hero is also a villain. And I think this is the sort of the crux of what was misunderstood in Washington, which is that Guston's whole body of work at this point is about his own sense that the villains and the good guys are not so easily distinguished one from the other. And their motives are also not so easily distinguished one from the other. And that he has a fascination with horror, with violence, which he worked out through his paintings. That at the same time, he feels, I think, some complicity with the violence of the society in which he lives. And so far from saying that the Klan paintings are, as they were in the initial instance, a protest against racist violence, he also understood that one is never very far from it in one's own life. And I think that the reductivism of the decision that was made in Washington completely ignores what's actually in the work.
Yeah, and I think this might be the first time in the full tilt manner, like confrontational, and at the same time very compassionate, which is a very strange relationship, Robert. But I think this may be the first time that Guston had identified himself with his own mortal enemy, so to speak. And
the idea of making something that is tragicomic, that already jams the system for a lot of people. They know how to say the word, but they don't know what it really means. They don't know what gallows humor is to its fullest extent. And then again, this is a case where he is not singing the virtue of the artist versus the villainy of the subject. He is making them equivalent in some way.
And also his deep interest in Isaac Babel, which I remember talking to Bill Corbett about this, Robert, in his book too, which I love reading. And Babel is a Ukrainian Jew like his parents. Particularly the short stories. So the reference to red cavalry is very profound. Can you share with us a little bit more about that?
Well, I wrote about that in the first Guston book I did, and I wrote about it again in this one. Babel is a very interesting character because he was a member of the Jewish community that was persecuted by the Cossacks. And so he was commissioned by the Red regime to join the Red Army and to ride with it and to tell stories and report on it for the general communist reader. And of course, that meant that he was embedded with his enemy, his traditional enemy. And he wrote about them with great vigor and with great understanding. And he also didn't feel all that much empathy for the shtetl Jews who were stuck in their old ways. So he was all about his conflicted emotions, and he made stories that come from it. Some of them are funny, some of them are horrifying. But Baba was a writer who was of great importance to Guston, and Guston in general was a great reader.
Yep.
He read widely, he read deeply.
Yeah, it's super true. So let's shift a little bit here. Next picture is one of my favorite. I think yours too.
Yes.
Flatland. Incredible paintings, huge panorama with various objects that are part of Guston's perpetual vocabulary, so to speak. Shoe, brick, clocks, canvas, the sun, even the foot in the middle. And yes, also pointing finger, you know. Pointing finger to me, Robert, is pointing finger meaning to the guilty one, you know, the finger pointing to. I always read it that way. I don't know about how you read it.
Okay, again, I think the pointing finger can be many things.
Yeah.
It can be to the guilty person. It can also be a device out of Renaissance painting where somebody in the painting points to the main event.
Yeah.
And gives you an indication of where to look for the main event. And I think Guston used it in all those senses. In this particular painting, I'm not sure, but because what he's pointing to is a calendar, but what that calendar or painting is hanging from the sky.
Yeah.
There's a brick wall further down. This is a companion or a sort of a catch basin again of all of his devices, and it's coming and going. You can't tell anymore.
Yeah, all floating in dispersed way across the canvas, which is interesting. I chose the next one. It's called Evident, also painted the same year, and I believe it's all included in the infamous show at Marlborough. So unlike the previous one, from the floating spreading out of form equally throughout the picture, as you say, some kind of unspecified destruction or destructive event, this now seem to group together, coalescent in the middle, like as if those objects are, sitting on the couch or something.
And also, if you look on the couch, you can see what probably at one point was a figure lying on the couch. The head is on the left,
yeah,
you're on the right, but he's also overpainted it so it's no longer an integrated figure. But this is the prototype, if you will, for a lot of paintings that he made of people lying down. Now, again, he had the bed in the room on the side of the studio. He was prone to melancholy. There's the Russian novel Oblomov about the man who basically goes to bed and stays in bed during a period of trouble in Russia. All the different variations of sloth, depression, and retreat are embedded in this, but those are the literary analogies. Just think of the mood, think of what it is like to be half paralyzed and half energized by reality. This is a good painting for what we've just been through. The lockdown is this painting and all of the ones that are around this. What is it like to be quivering with anger and at the same time unable to move?
Well, the solution is very easy. Get a bunch of hungry man food, Robert, microwave food. That will do the job. Nikki, can we go to the next one? I love this one, Mad Habit. To me, when I saw it, this is also painted in 1970. I immediately felt like both of his painters that he loved, Piero and Morandi. I mean, this one looked as if both of them shaking hands over what is being considered stability, serenity, or what is being considered super anxious, or both, to be questioned to which degree and measure. But boy, oh boy, that whip gesture on the right there, Robert.
Yes.
We saw that earlier, and this is definitely a direct reference to Piero flagellation in the Urbino.
Yes.
Left.
It's way back. And it's also Penitentes who did this. There are many variations on this. And this is self-punishment, self-blame. And he's got bottles, vast bottles, way beyond the ordinary quart bottle that you can buy in a liquor store. And he was a heavy drinker, and he knew that it was not doing him any good, but he did it anyway. And all those guys were, not all of them, but most of them were. So this is him sort of equating drinking and painting, being an artist and heavy drinking, and the depression that goes with that. And this was not so long before Mark Rothko committed suicide, and Mark Rothko was a friend of his, and Mark Rothko clearly was in alcoholic depression when that happened.
Yeah, amazing painting. Square format. Okay, Nikki. So there's something. This is quite nice. If the Marlboro show didn't go so well, why not take a trip to Italy? This is what he did in the year that followed, 1971.
He went back to Italy.
Yep.
He went back to the well, literally. Here's a fountain, but it's the well. And he went back to his source, and he was able to both ride out the shock of the Marlboro show and also to reconnect with one of the reliable sources of information and ideas and energy that he had always counted on. So and these are wonderful paintings. They're all quite small because, after all, he was coming back to America. They're mostly on painted on paper. And this is a garden in Italy. There's a kind of there's a gigantic, colossal foot of the kind that you find on the, I forget which hill it is, but it's one of the hills in Rome.
Yeah.
There's a pine on the that looks like like a popsicle, but it's a Roman pine that's all the way to the other side. There's a fountain spewing water. There's a book, and this is a fantastic picture because it says a lot without really showing you all that much.
Yep, it's so true. We can see the next few, Nick, painted in the same time. Yep.
And this I love, and this is okay. There are many, we saw it already once, but there are many cases where there are these bricks suspended in air. And again, there is kind of an allusion to, Carl Andry and other people who were going to raw building materials as a source. But there's also Crazy Cat. And Crazy Cat was the cartoon series that he followed as a kid and that he studied as a kid and that he went back to stylistically as inspiration. And one of the Mouse's ways of getting attention of Crazy Cat, the intended lover, the betrothed, was to throw a brick at her. So this is like a barrage of bricks being thrown, but being suspended. But then, of course, it's the modernist grid. It's the modernist grid breaking up. Down below, it's in locked formation. Above, it's floating. And then, of course, it's Mondrian.
Yep, exactly. The interval between is just miraculous. And we have the next one, Nick. I believe it's, yep, that one.
Yep. And I don't mean to say that Guston was painting Mondrian and all these things consciously. I think he was so imbued with these images and these prototypes that they came naturally. They were a second nature for him, as most painters have their second nature. De Kooning didn't exactly intend that his images always be what they were, but they had to come out that way sooner rather than later, but eventually anyway, because he had thought about them so hard. He made the motions that created them so many times. And I think at a certain point, painting of this kind is not an automatic pilot in terms of being thoughtless, but the thoughts and the decisions are all at the level of execution. They're all at the level of increments of freshness rather than radical differences in imagery.
Well, you take the last one, I take this one. Okay, Nikki, next one. All right. Another masterpiece. This is a
declaration. This is a declaration of his affinities or his devotion or his indebtedness to some of the classics of Italian art. Masaccio, whose portrait he drew when he was earlier on there, and who then he redrew. Piero Francesco, who is the man about who he wrote an article for Art News. Giotto, obviously, and Tiepolo. And then there's De Chirico on the side. So this is, I don't know what the right word is, but these are the top five for him of Italian painting.
So it's homage, really.
It's homage.
Yeah. And we decided to show this one next for a reason, because your favorite.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah. Share with us a little bit more, Robert.
Okay, you can see that here again, the self-flagellant characters come back, but now the drawing style has changed considerably. And now there's a head who's come out from underneath the hood. And it's this weird lima bean headed guy with the great big bulging eyes and the stubble. This is a different incarnation of the artist, and you'll see the shoes behind him. Now, the soles of shoes, as I said, appear in drawings in the 30s and 40s,
Yeah.
and again they appear in the Tormentors, and here they are once again, but they have bulk and weight and heaviness to them, and they also are now interchangeable to a certain extent with bricks. They're piling up. So everything that Guston used could turn into something else.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think you can see that there are a lot of the basic shapes that I referred to just come back as abstract shapes.
And the light bulb that you love is now barely visible on the right.
But it's also basically a circle with something attached to it. So if you go back to the Sengai thing, it's a circle, rectangle, triangle, whatever. It's all there again and again and again.
Yep, and it corresponds with the shade from the window with the handle in the belt below. It's a great painting. Nikki, can we see directly to the next painting, which is called, yep, it's the weirdest painting of all time. It's your favorite.
It's one of my very favorites. Yes. No, this is kind of an inexplicably wonderful, strange painting. You know, it is the whole painting is devoted to the flesh of a face and this eye, and yet the painting is the body of the figure that's in the painting, and the eye is isolated and looks back at you or us, I should say, or looks back at the artist. I'm not sure which. But it also, the painting is a slab. This painting is a stone, a tablet as much as it is a canvas, even though it has nails and folds on the side that indicate it is canvas. It's just this incredibly concise, dense version of a group of signs and symbols that he'd been using for a long time. And it just fits perfectly in the space.
And I love that one nail in the middle is not yet been hammered in.
And again, I dare say that all the canvas, which is just a middle gray, is raw canvas.
Yep, that's it. He must have painted this painting fairly quickly, which nicely lead to the next one. One of my favorite also. It's called Painter's Form, and painted 1972, 2 years after the Marlborough show, Robert.
Yep. And the equivalence he makes between visual images and speech is strong. And if you think, is maybe a stretch, but if you think of hand to mouth, the sculpture of Bruce Nauman's, which equates the word written and the word spoken, this is a similar kind of abbreviation of concepts of language through an abbreviation of bodies.
You know, it's interesting too. It reminded me so much of a good friend of yours and mine, Nancy Sparrow.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it? Is there a subtle reference to Artaud? Because Artaud was Nancy's absolute favorite poet, because it's allowed her to think about possibility where text or fragment of the body sort of can be part of the reflection of the inner pain, and they can be dispersed into the space in expanded way. I mean, was Guston at all interested in Artaud? I never asked you that question.
I have no idea, but I don't think so. I can't be sure. Artaud was translated, was available in City Lights books and so on and so forth, but Artaud wasn't that widely translated. And again, he wasn't that much of a Francophile, but Artaud did think in terms of speech acts as being squawks, cries, inarticulate. And this is in a way kind of an inarticulate squawk of images.
Yeah, okay. Well, I thought I would ask. Nikki, can we see?
That's the great thing. Make correlations which, even if they are not grounded in history or biography, they're there because the things that the artists are referring to are in our common experience.
Yes, exactly. So unlike the other thing, flatland, where everything is floating in the air, dispersed out the whole space, for once, they all rested on the table firmly. And this is Painter Table, painted 1973, and which is the cover of your book.
Yes, and it's a wonderful painting, and it's got everything, as you said. Now these irons are worth mentioning. Guston collected irons, because they were paperweights, but he also collected them because he liked the form. And increasingly, they enter into the iconography of his paintings at this stage of the game. But then again, you can see the shoes upturned, which show up in earlier things. Among other things, they show up in drawings which are related to the Holocaust. There's cigarette butts in an ashtray and cigarettes burning on the edge of a table. It's got everything, but it's so simple and it's so dense.
Yep, and I love the tiny window shade in the back.
Yes.
On the left, resting there. All right, so let's go to I think we can go to the next one more. Okay, so this is Tricky Dick, San Clemente. It was shown in the show that Musa Mayer, Guston's daughter, and Sally Raddick put it together at Hausenworth, along with that beautiful group of Nixon drawing from 71 to 75. That was at Hausenworth in 2017. So you've written extensively on this, Robert.
Well, this is also a period of time that I remember very vividly myself.
Okay.
But this is the time of Watergate, basically, or what led up to Watergate. And Guston, who had not been a political painter for years, began to make drawings that were explicitly political. There is an implicit politics in all the Klan paintings, but this is where he actually names names and uses his cartoon skill to identify the absurd, clownish, and also malevolent characteristics of the Nixon regime. And at this time, he made a friendship which was very important to him, and that's with the novelist Philip Roth.
Yep.
And Roth had left New York after the publication of Portnoy's complaint, and like Guston, he was kind of a refugee, an internal exile in Woodstock, and they hit it off. And again, Philip Roth was Jewish. I think it was a way of replacing the lost friendship with Morty Feldman to some extent, or it was a new friendship, whichever. They hit it off, and Roth published a satire of the Nixon regime called Our Gang, and as a parallel project did a series of drawings, and then they took off and went beyond illustration of any kind. There is only one painting, however, which is that resulted from that series of drawings, and this is it. And this is Nixon in exile in San Clemente, California, and he's got his phlebitic leg. He is feeling self-pity by the edge of the beach. The pose is a little bit taken from, I don't know, Beethoven or somebody like that, marching with his hands behind his back and his coattails out. It's all kinds of different motifs and references and tropes. The important thing about these and the drawings is, again, there is an element of identification of the artist with his subject, because he also came from a Southern California time, as did Nixon. He was also lower middle class. He understood what Nixon was about, and he understood it from the inside, not from the outside. He was a child of Russian Jewish immigrants or Ukrainian Jewish immigrants. He was not at all the same ethnicity, which is another reason why identity politics gets so screwed up, because just the obvious facts of one's ethnicity are not enough to explain the paradoxes of being something or something else. In any case, he understood Nixon, and he was horrified by him, but he also understood him. So when he painted this, he painted a self-pitying guy lost in the world by the beach in California, and he was in a way also feeling sorry for himself in upstate New York some of the time. And I think there is a level of ambivalence in this painting, which at least is interesting to me as the ways in which it's clearly a satire and a brutal satire of Nixon. It's also the most overtly grotesque painting that he ever made. And if you think, I remember having a conversation with Peter Saul years ago, and where Peter said of Guston, oh, he's softcore, and identifying himself obviously as hardcore. I don't think that's a fair judgment, but I do think this is the closest that Guston ever came to doing what Peter does.
Yeah, and I'm interested too. Maybe I think hopefully both Sally and Musa are here. I would love to know whether this was painted in 75, Robert, whether it's painted at the tail end of the Vietnam War or not. I just want to know the month and the date. That'd be terrific. Okay, the next one let's move a little bit fairly quick. So we have a little bit more to go. The next painting, oh, this one is so haunting. All right. What is he hiding from, Robert?
I don't know whether he's hiding or whether he's trapped. I think
Okay.
one. And he's smoking his cigarettes and he's drinking his booze and he's stuck behind this wall and the skies have turned dark and his hair has become thinner and his bloodshot eyes have become more bloodshot. And this is a painting of a haunted man.
Yep. Yeah, that's the better way to see it. Nikki, next one, he's the opposite of this one. He's pretty good in all three activities: smoking, eating, and painting. Hello. So this
Yep.
is painted in 1973.
And this is a number. There are a number of paintings of this exact image, and then many more of men lying down in bed smoking, or lying down in bed. And this is the catatonic Guston, the paralyzed Guston, the Guston who is a prisoner of his appetites and a prisoner. And I don't mean it's just Guston. It's anybody who's been in that situation. I respond to this because I've been in this situation. So But I also like the fact that it's French fries.
Yes, very much so. So yeah, this one is the opposite, a little bit more hopeful maybe.
This is essentially a portrait of his wife Musa,
Yeah.
who was his pole star his entire life, and who he needed desperately, but who he did not always treat well, and about whom he felt considerable guilt. And yet here she is riding above the waves. The flood has happened, but she is the rising presence above the waves.
And it's
So
a big painting, just so we know.
what?
It's a huge painting too.
A huge painting too. And again, it references Italian Renaissance paintings. This is not coming from nowhere. This is coming from many somewheres. But it's a relatively peaceful painting, and it's an homage to Musa, of which there were many around this time.
Yes, that's right. The next one's a little bit more grim, incredibly haunting painting to me. They are together in bed, Robert.
And they're facing each other. There is another one where they're facing away from each other. This is a man who knew a lot about marriage.
Yes. What, the corner there, the triangle, for years and years I thought was a slice of pizza, but you corrected me. It's
I didn't correct you. I don't know for sure, but I think it is a corner piece from the canvas. But I also think that some of these forms just show up because that part of the painting needed a form.
mm-hmm.
And it does. I mean, the brushes establish a shape area with the bedding, but it doesn't really hold. If you take it out with your thumb, which is what painters often do, if you take it out, that becomes a weaker corner, right?
Yeah.
But if you put it in there, the geometricizing, the triangulation of that space becomes much more dynamic. And painters get to do stuff like that.
Yep. Yep. It just as he painted both on the darker of the edge of the arm where the leg is leave unpainted.
Yeah.
Next one, Nikki. This is your favorite, I think.
It's one of my very favorites, and this is again about marriage. And this is two people at night in a turbulent sea, whether they're drowning, whether they're swimming, whether they're going forward or going back is unclear, but they're very much a couple. And the golden hair that she has is the only uplifting thing in the painting.
Yep, it's so true. Jesus. Not easy. Life is hard. The next one, Nick. Also your favorite?
Another one of my favorites. Yeah, this is again, we're back to that canvas as slab. Now we have time officially invoked. Here is a clock. Had me but world enough in time. This is reading the book, painting, and time. And those are his life, basically, at this point. He's living up in Woodstock. He has some friends that come to see him, mostly poets. Bill Bergson, Clark Coolidge, Anne Waldman, others, Bill Corbett, and so on. But he's pretty much on his own with Musa up there, and he's a great reader. And there's an interesting library there that he spent a lot of time dipping in and out of.
What is the question mark on the book on the left there, Robert?
Well, I don't know what it is, except it is a question mark, and that means a book is not an answer, maybe it's a question.
Okay. Nikki, can what's next for, we coming to the tail end, maybe?
The painting called The Dilemma.
Yep.
He mentions, he says, the artist, the composer, the painter, the sculptor, the poet, excuse me, the poet, the sculptor, the painter, and the composer. And you can see lying on his side somebody with glasses and a shock of hair. That's Morty coming back. In the distance are the basic geometric elements, the circle, the square, and the triangle. Now, it should also be said that he owned an image, not the original thing, but an image of Durer's Melancholia, in which geometric elements appear as protagonists, if you will, of the image. And that is another thing. He every day looked at that print when he went in to have lunch at the table in his kitchen. And then over the horizon is Musa's head, I believe. And I don't know who the purple, bluish head is, but these are, I think maybe Ross Feld is one of these people. But anyway, he had friends who were writers, but this is his reality.
Yeah, I mean, this painting is a major painting. I remember once talking to Dory Aston about why she chose her book to be called Yes and But. And she said that that's because Guston's favorite Kierkegaard book was Either Or. So it is a dilemma, for sure.
And by the way, when we had a memorial to Morty Feldman at the studio school when I was with Jackie the Dean, it was a concert of piano music played by one of his proteges. And then we hung this painting. David McKee was generous enough to loan it to us. And we hung this painting behind the piano. And it was a fantastic afternoon.
Beautiful. Yeah, we just published that in our newsletter, the first one. Okay, we can safely go to the next two paintings. Very interesting to me. This one have the address on it, 660, right by the door there. And we open the door and there's, a pile of shoes stacking in.
The world invades.
The world invades, exactly. Let's go to the next, Nick, just so we compare.
Just go back for 1 second. You'll notice that there's a whip on the side of the door.
Yeah.
Some have an umbrella next to their door. Here's a whip.
Yeah. Yeah, but this one is so interesting, right? It's piling in, the world invade. The next one, so that's indoor and this is outdoor. So you open the door here and then they are outside too. Where do you go?
And they're cockroaches.
In the below, yeah. So this one is amazing. I love this painting. Nikki, all right, I think we have a few more. This is your another of your favorite.
This is the Proud Boys and their master. Thugs marshaled by a hand with truncheon.
Come right back wherever it was. Yeah, and the next one.
And this is fantastic painting. This is like an apocalyptic painting from the Renaissance, but not. And there are many paintings, in fact, where hell is shown as a crack in the crust of the earth, beneath which all the souls are in torment, and then above is the world, and above that is heaven. There's no heaven here. There's blood raining down from the sky in the painting that's sitting on the horizon line. There's fire on both sides, and then there are all these bodies just sort of cast into the pit. It's an amazing painting.
Yeah, when I first saw this painting, I also thought of Bruegel, the blind leading the blind that fall into a ditch, Robert? But then the ditch and then to the pit, I don't know, there's certain aspect of pun in Guston's work. I haven't put my finger on it, but I would like to one day. But notice the letter to the left there, which reappear super soon. Nikki, let's go to the next one. Yeah. All right, this painting at the Met.
Okay, you see the garbage can is full of bottles. Again, that's almost autobiographical, anecdotal. And anybody who's been a heavy drinker will recognize that.
Yeah.
You have these stamping feet, the invasive, marching forces outside, and then these arms with trash can tops fending them off. And again, this is a reprise, as you indicated earlier, of that earlier painting that from the time of the 30s, where you had kids battling with wooden staves and shields made out of garbage can tops. So again, he goes back to earlier vocabulary and depicts a predicament, shall we call it. There are also these spiders that are crawling on the bottom of the bottom plane, and spiders come up in numbers of other paintings too.
Yeah. Next one, Nick. Okay, so this one is a haunting image, not that similar to painter's form, you know, speak out and think for out, Robert. This one instantly reminded me so much of his interest in Kafka. I know we won't have time to go into it, but let's just touch on it a little so that everyone is aware of it.
Well, he was a big reader of Kafka, and he thought a lot about Kafka. And I could have gone down the Kafka rabbit hole and Kafka, but I decided not to. I decided I didn't want to make this book an exegesis of his sources. But if you read Kafka carefully, you find over and over and over again references. For that matter, the cockroaches are straight out of Kafka. But the point is that this is like this sort of helpless gagging on things, and whereas the earlier painter's forms was speech, this is vomiting language, vomiting forms.
Yeah, and it's also very interesting. We won't go to rabbit hole of Kafka, Robert, but it's just one thing I want to point out, that Kafka wrote in German, not in Czech, and he had that. Had it been for Max Brod, who worked so hard to brought to our attention. In other words, he didn't burn the manuscript. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Kafka, period. Just put that in mind later. But can we go to the next one, Nick?
I hope somebody does go down the rabbit hole of Kafka. I just don't have, pardon the expression, world enough in time.
Yes. So this one is the one that got somehow metal plated, screwed together, both sides.
To be locked in combat. That's what this image is really basically.
Amazing. Love that painting. All right. So the next one is the one that we thinking of.
And if you in some ways see the legs as being the suitor, yeah, and the hair as being the sort of the damsel, or the Juliet and the Romeo, or the husband and the wife, or the whatever it is also about the impossibility of their situation. And that possibility is tragicomic. Again, the tragicomic register, the mode, is the mode of all these late paintings.
Yeah.
And he knew that he was making funny pictures. They are funny, but they're funny pictures about unfunny things. And I think that one of the failures of art is when it gets only into the tragic mode. It's almost impossible to make a fully tragic picture. And it's happened very few times in the history of art. But these are able to refer to the things that are tragic, but with a way that is more open, and that more accords with the ambivalence that people feel in the face of all kinds of terrible things.
Yeah, and also that same letter that we saw on the left of the pit, Robert.
Yeah.
So this is as if trying to get out the pit, but then turn to something else, incredibly open space. So it's very ambivalent. It's hard to tell. Nikki, can we go to the next one? This is another of your favorite, Robert.
This is a great painting, and this is him alone at night. Now, Guston painted at night almost exclusively.
Yeah.
Or not exclusively, but his best painting came at night. And he would go into his studio. The house was one place across a grassy area, and he would go into the studio, which was built behind it, which is a cinder block studio without the glamour of contemporary studios at all, but was entirely a working studio. And he would paint for hours and hours and hours by himself. And then at the end of the night, or at the end of the working night, he would come back to the house and go to bed and try and figure out what happened. And if he pulled himself back from the studio, he would curl up next to Musa, I presume, much as you see him in that painting of the two of them in bed. Mm-hmm. But he would get back to bed with his head full of thoughts. So he wasn't yet at rest. So these are, again, these are things that are important to say, not because the subject matter is Guston, but because Guston is the protagonist that Guston fielded, talk about things that happen to all of us to some extent. And the business of having the 3 o'clock in the long dark night of the soul, 3 o'clock in the morning experience has happened to virtually everybody. And nowadays it happens, I think, almost everybody. Anyway, so this is Guston in his studio trying to paint what it is that is eating him, and he does it amazingly. Now you see he's got the stubble, he's got this eye that can't close, it's all there.
And this was painted just a year before his death, Robert, so 79. I want to show the next painting, a monumental one, called Pyramid and Shoe. So it's painted 2 years earlier. It's a big painting.
It's a very big painting.
And it's loaded with iconography, symbol.
It is. But to my knowledge, and David and Renee McKee, who know this painting better than I, might be able to supply the answer, but I don't think this says anything specifically. I think this is the point at which his metaphysical symbols are living their own life in his space.
Yeah, Renee wrote a beautiful essay on it, actually, Robert.
Really?
Yeah, it's just a relationship of the landmark, monumental, pyramid, and then the shoe right next to it, an ordinary shoe blowing up in that same scale.
It's the human element, which is in a totally non-human scale. And
Right.
again, he'd been to Rome, he'd seen the colossal foot that's on the Capitoline Hill, I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, all of these disorientations are part of the universe that he lived in, thought in, imagined in. And all of them come in one way or another from de Chirico and from metaphysical painting, from that degree of estrangement that he experienced in Kafka, he experienced in other writers, of not being at home in this world because it's not a homey place, but not necessarily a kind of forced dislocation, as you'll find in French surrealism.
And I love the tilted horizon, that sort of forced the shoe to slide to so ever slightly to the pyramid. Okay, can we go to the next one? We got 2 more to go. All right, so this is monumental.
This is T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
He's Coker, and he was a great reader of Eliot, although Eliot was a notorious anti-Semite. And Eliot wrote the 4 quartets, in one of which he says, "In my beginning is my end." And as his end approached, I think he thought again and again about Eliot and about what the meaning of that. Because if you look at that last painting, and if you look at any of these paintings, there's so much of his prehistory in them. They are paintings that could not have been painted by a young man at all, and in which the older man doesn't feel the necessity to explain. This is the world that he made for himself. He fully inhabits it. And when he plays games with its elements, moves them around, shifts scales and so on, that's the liberty that he has. He is a demiurge, and he's able to do that because he created this space.
Yeah, and it's begins with "In my beginning is my end," and then it ends with "In my end is my beginning."
Yes.
So kind of amazing. Can we go to the line, Nikki? Because I wanted to show it desperately. With Paul, with the arm, with hair stick to the side, with the drawn line. This one is coming from above, out of the sky.
Yep.
And it's a big painting.
It's a very big painting.
Yeah.
And there's a line of Ezra Pound, which I love, which is, "It is the quality of the affection that carves the trace in the mind, dove sta memoria." And I think this is actually kind of connected to that. All I don't know that Pound was really on his reading list all that much. But the idea is that the affection, when an artist has an affection for the things he creates, she creates, for the world that is represented by those things, and that is what, it's the quality, the particular quality of someone's affection for the things of their imagining and for the things of their experience that carves a trace in the mind. That is why we pay attention to them.
Yeah. It's a brilliant touch with the black line, Robert, slightly tilted as opposed to the tilted horizon going the opposite direction.
And it also makes God an artist.
Yes, it's so true. We have two more before we open up, you guys. This is the two last paintings, painted with acrylic on, I believe, illustration board. So this is the first. You see the lumen sun behind there. Robert?
Guston had a near fatal heart attack sometime before he actually had a fatal heart attack. And in the interval, he painted on paper a whole body of work, most of which ended up at MoMA. Mr. Guston gave very generously to MoMA both big paintings and paintings on paper. And this is from that group. And they're amazing pictures. They really are. And they have many of the motifs that his other paintings do, but because they're on paper and because the size is smaller, they read differently. But this is a kind of Sisyphusian rock,
Yes.
rolling uphill or rolling downhill. You don't know which.
Yep.
And it's, again, I think a metaphor for the end of something.
And the last one be in the similar forms, rolling down or going up. But this one had bandage on his face, Robert.
Yes. And he's looking longingly upwards, but I don't think he's going to get there.
Yeah, I was so compelled. Again, I haven't figured out how to put my finger on it. But when I look at the ear here, the ear is really the letter C, Robert. And the letter C is the C and I on the right there, looking through the horizon beyond that slope. I don't know. But this is the very last image that we have here. I wanted to essentially turn back to you, Catherine, because I think it's, we talk about, it's now 2:45, Robert. So let's open up for Q&A. You mind?
No, not at all.
Awesome. Thank you.
But just like I see a lot of friendly old friends in Jim Melchert's out there, and C.D. Lansing's out there, and Dorothy Lichtenstein is out there. And anyway, hello.
Hello. Morgan Spangle's here too. Hi, Dorothy.
Yes, so we have so many friends in the audience, and we have a ton of questions. Our first question comes from Ariel. I will prompt you to activate your mic now.
Okay, so hello, this has been wonderful. So my question that I wrote kind of back when you guys were talking, it was at the first part of the lecture, and you guys were talking about the process that he was painting in and doing the all over paintings and that sort of thing. And my question was, and I'll just read it, is, do you think artists will work again in this formal process-based way? Have we shifted to an art world that is totally consumed with politics, social issues, and identity?
I don't think we ever shift definitively in any direction. I think we add on capacity and add on dimensions. I remember a long time ago when photography began to be a big factor with painting in the 1960s, and people said, well, you know, painting is going to be obsolete. Every time you add on a new possibility, it seems to take all the attention, and then it soon becomes apparent that there are only a certain number of people who can actually be inventive artists in that medium or in that context or from that mindset. So I think we're going to have all the old stuff that we used to have, plus this new stuff. I'm not a big fan of identity politics, as I think I've made plain. It's not because I don't believe people have identities, but I believe that individuals forge their own ideas out of the stuff around them and the stuff that's in them. And I think that the individual identity forged by people is what interests us in their work. So I think the givenness of identity is only half the story. Less than half the story.
Quarter half.
Quarter, okay, Phong.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Sarah Thackeray. Sarah, I will ask to activate your mic now.
I wondered how Guston has influenced your own painting practice and what questions we can glean from, what kind of lessons we can glean from him.
He was a bit of a problem for a while because I wanted to be him. I remember Chuck Close telling me once that he'd met de Kooning, and he said to de Kooning, well, you're the only person who's made more de Koonings than I have. And I sympathize with that. I also remember the story that I read somewhere about Guston meeting de Kooning, and where de Kooning and Guston were talking about how the influences were being exchanged, and how suddenly Guston was more imitated than de Kooning, and they were having a laugh over this. And then I think the upshot of the story was basically, but they only imitate the parts of your work that you don't like. So, you know, this goes on and on and on. You know, influence and so on are important. I've learned a lot from Guston. I most of all learned that I wasn't Guston, and I couldn't be Guston. And so, what I am, I'm still finding out. I'm just about to retreat entirely into my studio. This book is the last book I'm going to do. I had 2 shows on the schedule that COVID pretty much ended the possibility of ever doing. So I'm now going to be doing, I'm going to be either an emerging artist or a submerged artist, but I'm going to be nothing but an artist from here on.
Thank you so much. Our next question I will read on behalf of Karen Schifano. And the question is this: why do you think Guston's narrative painting was so threatening to abstract painters? Had abstraction become a kind of ethic?
I think abstraction for some people was an ethic, but I don't think it was all that threatening. I think it was threatening to abstract champions of abstract painting in the critical community, who built their reputations on saying that their guys and their ism was the only game in town. Artists tend to recognize other powerful artists, even in idioms that they don't originate or don't even have initially much sympathy with. It's worth remembering that the person who picked Pollock out of a show at Peggy Guggenheim's for special attention was Mondrian. Okay? And it's worth knowing that Jasper Johns owns Guston's. People don't, necessarily if you think of what Judd and Solowit collected, wildly diverse. So I think it's really a mistake to think that the thing that makes somebody well known as an artist is the only thing they can tolerate. That kind of strict thinking is what teachers think, what what critics think, what people think according to rules rather than just by exposure to the best stimulus around. And I have lots of work that doesn't have anything to do with what I do, and it surprises people, but it doesn't surprise me. And I actually am happy about it because it allows me to channel those interests into something concrete. Because I'm a very, very direct, hands-on person. I don't like ideas in the abstract. I like ideas in some concrete form. So if somebody else does something that I admire, I am glad that they're doing it.
Similar to the way that Maya Shapiro had a deep friendship with Boris Best, Robert.
Yes. Or Elizabeth Murray said, the fact that you're right doesn't mean that everybody else has to be wrong. So.
Catherine?
Yes, we have a question from G.E. Schwartz. I will ask to unmute you now.
Greetings, and thank you so much for this afternoon. Question is, what can we say, if anything, about how Guston combined himself with his ideals?
How he did what?
How he combined himself with his ideals. In other words, how he brought things together and then combined that and then put that together. In other words, using his ideals as much as the reality that he lived through.
I'm not sure what you mean by ideals, but I think he was a speculative thinker and a speculative maker. He would try and make something to see if it held up, and if it did, he would make another, and if it didn't, he wouldn't. And I think many artists are like that. I don't think you paint your ideals. I don't think anybody paints their ideals, and when they do, it's usually not a very good painting. But you can say what if or maybe or whatever, and you try and find a way to give it form. And if you succeed, then there it is, and it's there for you too. Because even if your ideas begin to wobble or your convictions begin to wobble, it's there to tell you that it's still possible to believe in this thing. I mean, I think what we're going through now is a very clear example of it. It's hard to know what to believe in, right? Artists have an advantage. They make things that they can look at in the morning and say, I believed it when I made it then, and I believe it still, even though I couldn't necessarily recreate the circumstances in which that took place. And I think that's what the value of these things are for other people too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Dory Bowen, who unfortunately had to leave, but I will read it on her behalf since we are recording this and we'll be uploading it later. Her question was this: can you explain some of the other charged forms, characters, or patterns in Guston's work? His painterly vocabulary is fascinating.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Because there were so many strands of it. But let me just take one of them that just over and over comes back to me. The business of doing this mark and this mark was a way of dividing and nailing space down. He did it with broad brushes, he did it with small brushes, he did it in red, he did it in blue, he did it in gray. He did it all kinds of ways, but there was something extremely satisfying about making loose grids with strokes. And not just satisfying, it was locating. And he found his bearings in the painting that way. The viewer has that same option, which is to find their bearings in the painting because of the coordinates that are written into it. And he had the whole Renaissance tradition where grids were inscribed by the artist before they even built the compositions. But then, as I said, he also had the experience of the floating grid, which was what Mondrian brought him. So I think a lot of what he was doing was locating himself in space with marks. And, you know, there's the Vitruvian man, right? The guy who does this, right? And that is the man within a rectangle within a circle. That is the way in which we operate in the world. Our balance is a matter of left and right. And I think being able to establish your balance visually and physiologically in space is an accomplishment. It's not something that's given. And I've just had a couple of falls, so I know that's really not given. So, you know, I think that paintings allow us to do that. When I go into museums, I can almost feel, Mike, it's like, you know, in these movies now where they have the calibrated scientific measurements, you know, on the screen. There's a version of the, what do you call it, Sherlock Holmes stories, where there's all kinds of wonderful digital wizardry going on. Well, when I walk into a gallery, that's how I feel. When I was hanging shows at the Modern, I would walk into a room and I would feel the different grids in different increments as I moved through the space, and that's what I would try and do when I located paintings in them. I think everybody has that capacity, right? And I think what paintings do is allow us to exercise it.
Oh, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Elizabeth Brown. Elizabeth, I will ask to activate your mic now.
Hi, Rob. I was wondering about the piles of feet. Today, they looked very much like those Jericho still lifes of amputated limbs. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if that connection had ever occurred to you, or if Guston was interested in French painting.
Again, it hadn't occurred to me. Guston was interested in French painting, but not that much. I think what they really do is come from the stacks of bodies after the war in the Holocaust. I think that's the primary reference. But by the way, I see Elena Sesto out there. Hi, Elena.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from Robert Epp. Robert, I will prompt your mic now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Robert. This is fantastic. My question was about time and how Guston uses time in his paintings. There's lots of clocks and wristwatches and so forth. I was very conscious, you're looking at the work and seeing time being front and center. It strikes me as a real workman-like approach to making his paintings. He seems, you know, with the heavy boots, the smoking and so forth. He seems to work the night shift. So I wonder if it's something to do with his working approach or just what you would like to say about that aspect. Well, thanks very much.
I mean, Musa Meyer wrote a book called Night Studio, but I think maybe Night Shift is the name of a chapter in some other person's book about Guston. It'll come. You know, he was a nocturnal creature to all intents and purposes. So it was. I didn't know him. I tried to meet him just before his death and wasn't able to. So, but you know, having steeped myself in him, I was saying that he was a nocturnal creature, and he was able to function in that hours a day when time is in some ways suspended, and in other ways where you really make acutely aware of it. But I can't remember what the question was exactly. But time was always on his mind, and he was precociously gifted, and he had a precociously positive start. He was a big star in American painting just before the Second World War, or just after the Second World War. And he had a long career, but crammed into relatively few years. He wasn't 70 years old when he died, and he had already had a 50-year career. So I think for him, time was lived, and it was lived in episodes of intense engagement and intense melancholia, and when time drifted away.
I just wondered if he felt that the clock was oppressive and that he was always punching the clock. He was always on the clock.
I think it was, but I think sometimes he felt it ticking it away. He wasn't on the clock. That was the problem.
Okay, thanks very much.
Wonderful. So our next question comes from our very own Jason Rosenfeld. Jason, I will prompt your mic now.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Thank you.
Yes. Yes,
Great
we can hear you.
discussion today. Rob, I have a question about the connection between Guston and Peter Saul. I just interviewed with Amanda Guibisi, Peter Saul for the Rail a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about his show at the New Museum and how, it's kind of been under the radar in a sense, although of course the imagery is challenging and button pushing, and you could easily see people having some objections to it. How would you talk about that with respect to, the way that the Guston situation has developed recently? Thanks so much.
Okay, well, first of all, Peter, I have known for many, many, many years. He was a professor at Monira, and we've had big arguments and moments of wonderful friendship and so on and so forth. But Peter is a counterpuncher, and Peter tries to bait people, and he often succeeds. I don't think that was Guston's intent ever. And so it's surprising that it has happened in this way at this time. I think Peter's paintings of the Angela Davis period and so on and so forth are very provocative, and I'm surprised nobody's called him out on it. I hope they don't, because I don't think they're to be called out, but he is a deliberately perverse imagination at work all the time, being a perverse imagination. And I don't think anything that Peter's done is any better or any worse than what Karen Walker has done as far as those things go. There are many artists who are doing that these days, or Robert Crumb. The idea that you cannot make fun of other people without being a bigot about the species or race or ethnicity from which they come is crazy, right? Satire dies when there is no sense of humor. And satire is a very important leavening aspect in society. So I think it's a terrible mistake that this has happened. I think we're going to pay a very high price for it. And I think we'll pay it culturally, but I also think we'll pay it in civil terms, because humor is a safety valve. We know that hate is hate. We know that the Proud Boys do, in fact, hate Black people. I don't think there's any way that you can say that Peter does. And if he isn't always on target, fine.
We started late.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you so much. And, that there's the element of caricature also, which is so important to what Peter's doing and how he's playing with stereotypes. And, I really respect that. And, he, as you describe him, he was like that in our interview a couple of weeks ago. People can check it out on the Brooklyn Rail YouTube channel. He's quite rightly unrepentant, right? That is what he's doing, as you so well described it. And it's just a shame that people are not, at least for the moment, going to get to see Guston's works, and think about them in the same way.
It's the intent behind what you do. It is not just what you do. Brooks is an anti-Semite, right? No. But if you told those jokes in a time when people were hypersensitive to anti-Semitism, as they should be now, one could make a similar case. But how do you turn, Springtime for Hitler into an act of violence against Jews? You can't. Right. Even It's about one of the worst acts of violence against Jews that's ever happened. So I think that when you remove satire as a way of not just letting off steam, but also of caricaturing malignant caricatures, then you run into terrible trouble, and that's where we are.
Where's your book when
Thank you so much.
Hey, Jason, are you going to a sport?
No, it's just the Eagles won last night. So go ahead, Philip Guston. Don't worry about me. Thank you so much, Rob, for that. That's great.
Yeah, Robert, I just want to follow up a little bit, just to the what we brought up earlier about yes, but, either or, and to response in my own cryptic way to GE's earlier question. You know, Carl Smith once said that the, you know, power begins with the identification of the enemy. You know, I think that us and them against them is exactly where we are today. And I think that for artists, particularly now in regard to Guston, now exhibition is an opportunity really to amplify why art is important, healing, mediation, agency. I mean, the idea of negative capability. Artists are the only one who can live in doubt, mystery, and, you know, without a need to reach out for any kind of justification. And it's unfortunate that we don't know how to, you know, cultivate. I hope that it will put back in the center. Anyway, that's enough for me. Back to you.
I
I hope
humbly just, because I don't think artists necessarily are better at that than anybody else. I think there are very few people who know how to live without defining themselves in negative, usually binary terms. But I think it is true that art, not artists, but art can show us how that is undone, and how art can show us where the ambiguities, the ambivalences, the mixed feelings enter in, and how powerfully pitted against each other they can be, such that they cannot be disentangled. And I did a show in Santa Fe that was devoted to the grotesque. I've written a lot about the grotesque. I didn't do it because I had a theory about the grotesque. I do it because I kept bumping into it in the things that attracted me. And mostly as a child of the 70s, when there were strong passions of either or, this or that, I found that that was just not working. Okay, so that the grotesque, which is the point at which you take antithetical terms and lock them in so that they cannot be separated from one another, that is really a way of thinking about the whole world. And the grotesque exists in all cultures. It exists in our culture very powerfully in the Renaissance, but also in the Baroque, also in the modern. And basically, the inability to think that such a category exists, that you can both love something and make fun of it, that you can both be afraid of something and embrace it. You know, that is our condition, right? And therefore, the artists who are able to depict or embody it convincingly are enormously valuable.
Yep, it's super true.
You know, Goya, who did some of the most passionate anti-war art ever, also made some of the most grotesque art ever, and they're connected to the same capacity. Gombrich, E.H. Gombrich wrote a wonderful essay on caricature, and he did a second one with I can't forget the guy's name, but he was a Freudian writer, and they were talking about precisely the ways in which the grotesque operates in caricature, where you find that point where you don't know anymore. Mm-hmm. And there's a German writer called Jean-Paul who called the grotesque soul dizziness, where you lose your bearings. Mm-hmm. You know, now that is a really important possibility, and I think the inability to live in a situation where you are soul dizzy is what pushes people off. It's not the ugliness of the caricature; it's the impossibility of getting your bearings and having that denied you by somebody else. But in fact, it's an enormously valuable activity.
You're absolutely right, Robert. The similar come to mind right now is Johann Lavater, the Swiss writer who wrote the first book on physiognomy, you know, where facial expression, posture, the way in which people walk and move, identify or at least correspondent with their own inner psyche. So if you have a prominent nose, or your forehead is also equally prominent, your eye is small and whatnot, it corresponds to what you were thinking inside, and that was used in the criminal system for a long time as the way that sketch artists still essentially doing it the same today when they identify a certain crime. You know, it's a very reductive and it's very unfortunate. We can go on forever. Is there time for a poetry maybe, or what do you think, Robert? You have any breath, any energy to go one more?
I have breath, and if I run out of it, I'll run and get a bourbon and come back. But anyway, you tell me.
Well, let's get one more or two more. I mean,
Okay.
I'm ready to go. Hello.
Yeah, this has been truly fascinating. We have two more questions. The next question I will go to Douglas Martin, who has a question about a specific painting. He will share screen briefly to show us that painting.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I was caregiver to an old friend of mine who ended up passing away, but I inherited a bunch of art from him, including 7 Guston paintings. And one that I wanted to share with you is a little strange. There are a wide range of his
Oh, wow.
different styles or whatever. This is Deluge 2 that's at the MoMA, and then this is Deluge 3. Of the Guston paintings I have, this one in the bottom right here says Deluge on the back. Do you have any idea of what was going on with this?
It doesn't look like Guston to me.
It doesn't look like a Guston to you?
No, it doesn't.
Because it looked like the Cyan 5 was in there, and a friend of mine was thinking that it was a Guston also, and I was like, it's really strange that it says Deluge on the back, and he's got those other ones that are called Deluge 2 and 3.
Yeah, no, it doesn't look like a Guston to me.
You don't think so?
Nope.
All right, Mike.
I'm not in the authentication business, but
Well, I just wanted your insight. I appreciate the insight there.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Our final question comes from Eleanor Swarty. Eleanor, I will prompt you to activate your mic now.
Hi. So this is piggybacking a little bit on Jason and Elizabeth's questions about influence, but I've never seen anything written about it, but I was curious if he was influenced by the Italian painter Domenico Nolli, particularly the sleeping images and the armchair images that he painted in the late 60s. Thank you so much.
I mean, I have no idea. He was in Italy. He would have been cognizant of Nolli, who was a very prominent painter at that time. But I have no idea. But in terms of influence, no, I doubt it, because Nolli's fastidious way of painting has nothing to do with his, except that there's a kind of gigantism that might correlate in some way. But I think in any case, influence is a powerful word. It means a real direct line to the center of somebody else's thinking. Artists are magpies, though. You know, if they see something in somebody else's work, you know, they are likely to pick up on it consciously or unconsciously. And I remember a story about Sally Gans bumping into Jasper Johns at the Malevich show in the Met some years ago. And she said to him, "What are you doing here? I didn't expect you to be interested in Malevich." And he said, "I'm just looking for something to use." So, and, you know, and it was both a sort of an act of bravado to say that, and it was also probably literally true. You know, artists are not, you know, you don't have to be sui generis. The idea that artistic identity and artistic authenticity comes from having all the ideas yourself and having no debts to anybody else is crazy, right? In Asian tradition, you often copy somebody else until you have mastered it entirely, and then you begin your work, right? So the Western idea that you wake up one morning and there's never been anything like what you're doing in the world before is a very limited cultural idea of what artistic creativity is.
They often change their name in order to escape their so-called public identification.
Yes, yeah.
In freedom from there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rob and Phong, for this truly fascinating conversation. A lot to think about on this Friday afternoon.
Okay.
At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our lunches with a poetry reading. And we've carried that tradition into these community events. And today I'm thrilled to welcome Ramya Ramana to the stage. Ramya is an Indian American poet, author, educator, and songwriter who writes on race, femininity, intergenerational trauma, faith, and the first-gen experience. She received her bachelor's at St. John's University, and her upcoming projects include creating a spoken word album and songwriting. Ramya is currently receiving her MFA in poetry at the New School. And Ramya, I will pass you a mic now.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super honored to be here. It's been fascinating, would be an understatement, to just listen and to learn more about this incredible artist. As I was looking, I was doing some research, and I know that Philip Guston had published a book called Philip Guston and the Poets. And it was a book of illustrations of his work paired with poetry and 5 different poets, I believe that match some of his poetry. So I wanted to honor him and read actually one of the poems, and one of the authors, his name is Ted Berrigan, and I thought this poem was really interesting. It's called Around the Fire. What I'm trying to say is that if an experience is proposed to me, I don't have any particular interest in it, any more than anything else. I'm interested in anything. Like I could walk out the door right now and go somewhere else. I don't have any center in that sense. If you'll look in my palm, you'll see that my heart and my head line are the same. And if you'll look in your palm, you'll see that it's different. My heart and my head feel exactly the same. Me, I like to lay around of a Sunday and drink beer. I don't feel a necessity for being a mature person in this world. I mean, all the grown-ups in the world, they're just playing house. All poets know that. How does your head feel? How I feel is what I think. I look at you today and I expect you to look the same tomorrow. If you're having a nervous breakdown, I'm not going to be looking at you like you're going to die because I don't think you are. If you're a woman, you put yourself somewhere near the beginning, and then there's this other place. You put yourself in terms of everybody, the great cosmetic strangeness of the normal deep person. Okay, those who were those people, and I kept telling myself I have to be here because I don't have a country. How tight is the string? And what is on this particular segment of it? And the photographer, being black, and the writer, me, being white, fell out at this point. And he didn't want to look at it. I mean, it's nothing, just some drunk Indians riding Jersey milk cows, but I wanted to see it. I mean, it was right in front of my eyes, and I wanted, therefore, to look at it. And death is not any great thing. It's there or it's not. I mean, God is a progenitor of religious impetuosity in the human beast. And Davy Crockett is right on that. I mean, he's gonna shoot a bear, but he's not gonna shoot a train because the train is gonna run right over him. You can't shoot the train. And I always thought there was another way to do that. And it is necessary to do that, and we bear witness that it is necessary to do it. The only distinction between men and women is 5 million shits. Which, so I thought that poem was so interesting, and it kind of plays into, I think earlier, both of you were talking about his narrative style work, and this poem is so narrative style, but it's also quite existential. I wanted to share one of my poems. When I was when I was looking up the story of Philip Guston, one of the things I came across was that he would always kind of stay in his closet, and it was his place of creating a world, and it was his place of coming alive, and that's where he created some of his earlier works as a child. I believe it was a closet. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it just reminded me how much of what's going outside of our homes and what's outside of our closets or outside of like these respective worlds where we feel comfortable in affects us too. And so this is a poem I wrote a few years ago. A testimony in progress. The week before college, my mother tried to take herself. She was all dusty relic, crumb of martyr, symposium of darkness. My father found her at the house. Her body a tombstone of rumbling earthquakes. Is this what a failed exorcism looks like? He called 911 and took her to the hospital. By the time I get there, my father is gone. He has left to marry a woman from Thailand that he has just met a month ago. He was supposed to leave earlier that day and was complaining that he might miss his flight because of this. Her corpse only speaks in tremble. My father will not be back in the country for a month. I cannot afford a dead mother or a blink, because any moment she can become all skeleton, all lack of soul and still. I stayed at my pastor's house for a week. They made sanctuary out of their palms and held me like the last scripture that is read before the end of times. And at this moment, I understood why I always hated theology. Because when God happens, nothing else matters. The only thing I knew was to make a seatbelt out of this mouth, to understand that there is a time for everything. When my mother started getting better, she asked for my father constantly. I didn't know how to remind her that the contracts were signed, that in this country, ink means far more than blood. She started asking for the rest of my family, everyone except me, and I felt selfish for noticing this. A week later, her teeth open and close like the lid of a garbage can. She is able to carry conversation, and I'm not sure how I feel about this. For all she asks is for my father. I wonder then if mountains constantly ask for oceans, or if oceans cannot live without mountains. I realize neither of this is true. They are both beautiful and whole, and together they complement one another. This is a caricature of relationship, but people do not understand that the earth is just an infinite book of analogies on purpose, including me, because what do I know about human life besides that it is far more than just surviving? Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramya, for the beautiful and powerful poem. And thank you again, Phong and Robert, for this fascinating conversation. Please join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation between artist Louis Fertino and the Rail's very own artist and writer, Louis Block. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Yuna Kwok. And you should now all be able to turn on your microphone if you'd like to say goodbye as you leave. And thank you again for tuning in today.
Goodbye. Goodbye, Sarah Canwright.
Thanks again. That was great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was great.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Stay safe.
Woo, you too.
Much. Thank you for the
Hey,
beautiful-
Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phong.
Hey.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you so much, everyone.